Right. Well, thank you very much for asking me along, David, and to everybody who's joined for tonight as well. I'm going to take us on a journey through Kitchener and his relationship with Africa during the First World War. So, yeah, just bear with me as we go along, and hopefully you find it as interesting and as fascinating as what I have. So, I'm going to first start off with a bit about some terminology, because I tend to talk about the Great War. That's my preferred title or preferred term for the conflict of 1914-18. But I know that there's a group of people who think it should be called the First World War. And a lot of us also talk about World War I and use terms quite interchangeably. I think it's important to recognize this in the sense that First World War is a British term. World War I is a United States of American term, and the rest of the world, and particularly those of us from Africa, tend to use all of the terms as the flavor goes. And also the other interesting thing in terms of terminology when it comes to the Great War, First World War, World War I in dealing with Africa, is that we quite often have to get quite creative in terminology and descriptors if we're wanting to engage people in triggering memories. So quite often we will come across the first big war between the white men, the fight between the great white kings, or even Queen Victoria still resonating, the great white king against the great white queen. More commonly as well, or locally, we will have things like the War of Tanga or the War of the Carriers, compared to the Second World War, which is often referred to as the war overseas, irrespective of whether people served in Burma or in Europe. So back to the War of Tangata, the Carriers, the Great War in Africa. Africa effectively became involved in the Great War when its controlling powers went to war. However, the extent to which the various African territories participated depended largely on the local senior government official or military commander, depending on who had the stronger personality. Added to this, the outbreak of war and resulting confusion of the early days allowed for local vendettas to be avenged. In essence, I believe Africa fell into war, which meant that predetermined arrangements to keep areas such as the Congo Basin and East Africa out of the conflict failed. The British African territories had been warned at the end of July 1914 that war appeared imminent, but no action was required and further information would be sent once and if war was declared. This further information never materialized. London, Whitehall, or the British government, again, take your pick of term, had other priorities. The result was that each country made its own decision based on the circumstances it found itself in, while the British Navy or Admiralty acted in accordance with the Blue Book instructions on the declaration of war. This led to the bombing of Dar es Salaam on the 8th of August 1914. 4 days later, in response to British and French forces having entered German Togoland in Cameroon, the first British rifle shots of the war were fired. In Togoland by Gold Coaster or Ghanaian Alhaji Grinchi, and in Tibeta on the same day in East Africa, in response to an attack by the German forces there. The latter forces led to the occupation of the only British territory of the war by German forces for 18 months. Elsewhere in Africa, the Germans around the same time, and then again about a month before the war ended in 1918, invaded British Northern Rhodesia or Zambia, and in 1917 moved into Portuguese East Africa, Mozambique. Thus, by the time the German conquest to declare parts of Africa neutral during the war was received by the United States of America in September 1914, Britain and France had determined it was too late. Too many violations of neutrality had occurred on all sides. and it no longer suited any of the belligerents' interests. So would things have been any different had London been more prepared, and if Lord Kitchener had taken up the post of Secretary of State for War on a day or two earlier than he did? Kitchener officially assumed post on the afternoon of the 5th of August 1914. He had been stopped from returning to Egypt on the 3rd, and whilst he and Prime Minister Asquith were discussing the terms of his appointment, he attended the planning meetings which determined where the BEF would go in Europe and other aspects of the war. He knew what was happening, but because he had no official post, did not attempt to influence proceedings. This put him on a slight back foot when he officially took up the mantle of Secretary of State for War. This trait of Kitchener's, to not interfere unless in an authorized role, put him in a few tight corners during the war. Although he had no say regarding where the forces went, he did over which forces went, and this is what concerns us tonight. Kitchener had a strong sense of duty, which governed when and how he acted. It placed him in tight corners, some tighter than others, and which he could not always get out of. And here I think of his relationship with John French and the staffing of the Dardanelles being two examples, neither of which we're going to go into detail today. For today, we look at how this impacted on the war in Africa. Kitchener inherited a department that was far from war ready, at least for a war the scale Britain was embarking on. Charles Kelwell was to write in 1919 that, and I quote, "Someday, no doubt, an illuminating record of what the War Office achieved in transforming this country into a great military power under the inspired, if unorthodox leadership of Lord Kitchener will make its appearance." In my opinion, that study is still waiting to be done. However, Kelwell provides some insight into the man in question and what he was up against. Lord Birkenhead noted that on arrival at the War Office, Kitchener had no officer, quote, "of the General Staff in high rank and continuous employment at the War Office, capable of working out a staff plan for his consideration." In fact, there were only 8 unemployed general officers on the army list, and none of them were familiar with modern warfare methods. His CIGS, Charles Douglas, died in post on the 25th of October 1914 from strain and overwork, and was replaced by James Wolfe Murray, who had recently returned from Imperial Garrison service in South Africa. As a result, Kitchener took on much of their work, leaving little time for strategic consideration. Against this backdrop, he had to contend with politicians who had spent the previous 5 years trying to keep him out of office and were now taking a huge risk in appointing him, and a war being fought in areas he thought were unnecessary and distracting, such as Africa. Although the British African territories were all managed by the British government, in reality, various departments were responsible for different aspects of the war and local administration. While most African territories had moved in recent years from Foreign Office to Colonial Office control, the Foreign Office remained involved through having to deal with neighbouring colonial powers, such as Portugal, Belgium, and France, Britain's allies. Those territories with greater white settler populations, such as South Africa, Southern Rhodesia or Zimbabwe, British East Africa or Kenya, and Nyasaland, Malawi, had more say in their involvement than the protectorates and other colonies. All territories, irrespective of their status of independence, level of independence, were required to pay their own way. And in this regard, the senior civil servant, whether it was the Governor or Governor General, and the Colonial Office were responsible to the British Treasury. Militarily, West Africa had a long tradition with the War Office, which supplied army officers for the West African Frontier Force, formed in 1900. These units were more independent and developed, as seen by the attacks on Togo and Cameroon soon after the declaration of war, as the necessary infrastructure was in place. In East Africa, the military force was not as developed as in West Africa. The Colonial Office was still responsible for what were called internal policing actions and had a small black local force with white officers called the King's African Rifles. Across East and Central Africa, there had been 4 battalions. However, in 1911, one had been disbanded for economic reasons. The men from this unit had joined the German forces, and later, during the war, many were to return to the British ranks. And it's said that so many British King's African Rifles had joined the German ranks that the Germans started issuing instructions in English, which you can imagine the confusion when the two sides are opposing each other. Any expansion of the King's African Rifles, though, required the Colonial Office to approve funding. And as the colonies were not yet self-sufficient, officials were reluctant to give the War Office carte blanche. They had the added concern of potential internal uprisings, particularly if whites were seen killing whites, thereby threatening the governing administration. Maintaining the status quo was therefore preferred in what they thought would be a white man's war. In the white settler territories, other than in South Africa, where the Union Defence Force had come into being in 1912, none of the territories had standing armies to protect their borders. The most recent defence plans were still focused on internal threats. To maintain internal peace, the territories were protected by police forces, comprising, as the King's African Rifles and West African Frontier Force, black ranks and white officers. Although rifle associations, where settlers could maintain military-type skills, had been permitted. On the outbreak of war, these men were to enlist in voluntary units to help protect borders, such as the East African Mounted Rifles and the Nyasaland Volunteer Reserve. Appointments to military positions were secondments through the Colonial Office, not the War Office. But with the declaration of war, more men were needed, and so requests were put to the War Office to assist. With Kitchener's focus on the Western Front, his priorities did not include providing troops for Africa. Added complexities included India. Traditionally, the Indian Army was the first port of call for additional forces on the African continent when required, especially East Africa. The British West Indies Regiment assisted in West Africa. This was mainly due to proximity, but also there were similarities with terrain and environment for both external forces. India was to supply troops to both the Western Front and to East Africa, whilst also being the main supplier of material and equipment to the East Africa theatre. Kitchener having played a role in India becoming militarily self-sufficient when he was Indian Commander-in-Chief between 1902 and 1909. The final player influencing or impacting on what was happening in Africa and the other theatres, which Kitchener and local authorities had to deal with, was the Navy or Admiralty. The Navy was important for moving troops between vast distances between the different locations. It could take a week to get between Kilindini in Mombasa and Durban in South Africa. It was also required to effect blockades to prevent German supplies getting through, and had to arrange for material to be transported from India to Africa and elsewhere. Logistics were therefore crucial. Military action could not take place if the forces and their equipment were not in place, and that required cooperation with the Navy, a situation made more challenging when convoys were introduced. At the start of the war, the Defence Committee determining Britain's priorities for the war were agreed that action in Africa was to be for defence purposes only, to disable German wireless stations, deprive Germany of its ports, and to protect the shipping lanes. Emphasis on the Admiralty role. However, this decision, as mentioned earlier, was not communicated to the African territories. It was, though, in keeping with Kitchener's view. For him, Europe was the key. That was where the enemy was and where the main fighting would take place. The outcome in Europe would determine what happened elsewhere. So for Kitchener, it was pointless expending manpower and material anywhere else. His attitude became apparent when the Germans in East Africa crossed the border into British East Africa at Tabeta, near Kilimanjaro, on the 15th of August 1914. Reinforcements were required. The natural port of call was India, but Kitchener was hoping to get the majority of Indian troops to Europe. The result was what appears to be a seesaw discussion in London between Kitchener and the recently appointed Indian Military Secretary, Edmund Barrow, as to which forces to send and how many. Kitchener and Barrow had not seen eye to eye when they were both in India, which did not help matters at all in 1914. In the end, as expected, the main Indian forces were sent to Europe, with composite groups put together for Africa. This included imperial service troops raised by local Maharajas and funded by them. 2 Indian expeditionary forces were put together, one to defend the British East Africa border and the other to launch a coastal attack on German East Africa. Both expeditionary forces failed in their objectives. Reasons for the failure included vacillation over which forces were to go to East Africa and exactly when, which impacted on preparation. Troops had received no training for disembarking from ship onto the battlefield and had no time to acclimatize, many never having been on a ship before and now having spent 6 weeks at sea. By all accounts, the equipment had also been packed backwards for how it was needed on land. In addition, the commander A.E. Aitken, apart from being overconfident, was constrained by previous agreements made locally by the Navy and German land forces, which had not been ratified by the British Admiralty. The local naval commander refused to take his ships into Tanga Bay until the local German forces had been notified of the truce not being accepted. In addition, he wanted to sweep for mines. As a result, the element of surprise was lost. The outcome of the British defeat at Tanga, therefore, on the 4th and 5th of November 1914, saw the War Office take control of the military aspects in East Africa on the 22nd of November, leaving India to continue supplying equipment. Kitchener's immediate response was to ban offensive action. Only defense was permissible. However, if an opportunity presented itself, which was absolutely guaranteed, he was prepared to consider it. This he did when Richard Wapshare presented a case for an attack on Jason in December 1914. But by the end of January 1915, that too had failed. And if you're wondering where Jason is, on the green circles on the map, it's the second one up on the coastline, Tanga being the one below it. With a continued demand by the governor and thus the Colonial Office for reinforcements, Kitchener arranged in January 1915 that his 68-year-old brother Henry, HEC Kitchener, see what local forces could be raised. Henry Kitchener was a retired officer with the rank of colonel who had served in the West Indies prior to retiring in Jamaica in 1903. His arrival in Nairobi on the 13th of February 1915 with Lord Cranworth, a settler of East Africa, was viewed, unsurprisingly, with suspicion. The governor and settlers believing he had been sent to spy on them and to feed back to Lord Kitchener. While Cranworth felt the King's African Rifles could be expanded, Henry reported this was not possible. Henry, new to the colony, relied on the views of those he met, such as Lord Delamere, a leading farmer and settler, and with the governor being against war, to the extent that in September 1914, he was instructed by the Colonial Office to respond to the War Office, and the fear of internal uprisings. Henry fed back the majority feeling that no further white recruits could be obtained in country, and the colony did not favour recruiting more black men. However, it was felt that 1,000 Ugandans could possibly be raised, but the time required to train them made this unfeasible, as the war would likely be over by the time they were ready to go to the field. In mid-March, Henry suggested going to Madagascar to raise troops there, an idea seemingly planted by Charles Calwell. However, Kitchener overrode this following consultation with the Colonial Office. Reasons included French procrastination, but also a tacit agreement between Britain and France that France would concentrate on West Africa and Britain on East Africa. Apart from the time required to train raw recruits to a minimum standard for bush warfare, there were insufficient officers in Africa to train and manage new recruits. This had been caused by Kitchener's commandeering of officers on leave in Britain for service in Europe rather than allow them to go back to their regiments in Africa or India. For example, Arthur Reginald Hoskins, Inspector General of the King's African Rifles, got married in England on the 6th of August and then was sent to the 8th Battalion as AAQG on the 19th of September 1914. With little left to do on the recruiting front, Henry's role was changed to that of Inspector of Railway Defences, effective 10 May 1915. He stayed in East Africa for the remainder of the war in a military capacity, taking over the title of Lord Kitchener in June 1916, and was later to die on his African farm, aged 90, in 1937. Meanwhile, a solution to Kitchener supplying troops to East Africa arose in the form of Patrick Driscoll and the Legion of Frontiersmen. Driscoll had been hounding the War Office to allow the Legion, which is a paramilitary group set up in 1906 and still operational today, a role in Europe from soon after war broke out. Members of the Manchester unit were already serving with the Belgian army from before the BEF arrived in Europe. However, this was not in an official capacity, nor as a military unit. Driscoll, who had served with distinction in South Africa, leading Driscoll Scouts, offered the services of 1,000 men, all with frontier experience, many of whom had served in the 1899-1902 war in South Africa, also known as the Second Anglo-Boer War, or just more commonly, the Boer War. The problem with this group was that many were over the age limit and did not meet army recruitment requirements. Some were overweight, others overage, and others even missing limbs. Kitchener was very aware that the nature of this group was not suited to the discipline required of the British Army in Europe, but had not been sure what to do with them. Driscoll had suggested back in September that the Legion be sent to East Africa, but was declined by both the War and Colonial officers. The Indian Army would see the job done. However, within 4 months, the situation had changed in East Africa, particularly after the defeat at Jassam. This provided an ideal outlet for this obscure group and reduced one headache for Kitchener. Recruitment started in February 1915, and to regularize the unit, they were allocated as 25th Royal Fusiliers Service Battalion, Legion of Frontiersmen. Alex Baum has recently completed a study into the 25th Fusiliers, Legion of Frontiersmen, testing the title, The Old and the Bold. And he found that 10%, that is 114 men, which he sampled, of them, the average age was 45 or 49 years old, depending on whether you used the enlisted dates they gave as their true age or false age. I think the other battalion units that service battalion units that he looked at had an average age of 25 compared to our 45 or 49. Over 38 of the 114 had served in a previous war. 31 had served in the 1899-1902 South African War, 2 in Sudan, 1 in 1906 Natal Bambata uprising, and 1 on the Indian frontier. As a result, according to Alex, the regiment was sent to East Africa without any prior training, and we'll come back to that soon. They left for Africa on the 10th of April 1915, and after arriving on the 4th of May, were to serve as a unit until well into 1917, obtaining the 3rd African and 2nd East African VC, when William Dartnell was killed at Mactow on the 3rd of September 1915, protecting other injured soldiers. Another notable incident for this group was the death of one of the oldest British soldiers in the war, that of Hunter Frederick Selous, at the age of 65 in January 1917 to a sniper bullet. Captain Selous, as far as I can make out, was the second oldest serving soldier below major to have lost his life and the oldest in battle. The other was a training officer in London's Temple Inn. Selous had finally got to serve when he joined the 25th Royal Fusiliers. His earlier application to serve had been turned down by Kitchener himself, MP H.J. Tennant, informing Selous that Kitchener, quote, thought your age was prohibitive against your employment here in the UK or at the seat of war in Europe. The 25th Fusiliers took him on and he got to serve. The Fusiliers were also to be the second and last British Army regiment to serve in Africa during the war. The other was the 2nd Loyal North Lancs, who had arrived in East Africa as part of Aiken's Indian Expeditionary Force to attack Tanga, the Lancs having been posted to the Indian Army for their period of service before war broke out. Others from Britain who served in Africa served in existing African units, and that was across the continent. As a result of the War Office, and in particular Kitchener's position, that Africa was to be on the defensive, and that so many departments were involved in managing the campaign, little was done to organise a general staff or centralised administration, with the result that records of this early period are spread out across countries with little available in London, unless it was part of required reporting to the Colonial Office or India Office, and one has to say has survived the World War II fire and other culling in the case of India Office records. More significant for the time, 1914-18, and those on the ground, was the lack of coordination and a coherent approach to the war in East Africa, let alone anywhere else. This contrasted with West Africa, which, as mentioned earlier, had a longer history of War Office procedures. How much was due to people like Lord Lugard, governor of Nigeria, having served in the Sudan campaigns of the 1880s, is yet to be determined. As an aside, I think there's a study here calling to be undertaken, mapping the trajectory of the colonial army development from the West Indies to West and then East and Central Africa. Richard Smith has done the British West Indies. It now needs extending to Africa. And you can see that as you read the Colonial Office files as well. Decisions are made concerning the West Indies in years gone by, then in West Africa, and they don't repeat the arguments in East Africa. They know why the decisions have been made. But I think it's really worth somebody taking a deeper look. Back to 1915. This year was to see a major change in the war policy concerning the African theatres. The Legion of Frontiersmen, despite their sacking of Bukoba after its defeat, had shown what could be achieved against the Germans in East Africa, but remained on the defensive. Togoland in West Africa had fallen to the Allies at the end of August 1914, the first Allied victory of the war, allowing the troops from there to focus on Cameroon, which continued as a military theatre until February 1916, most of the territory being under Allied control by the end of 1915. Further south, in Southwest Africa, or today's Namibia, the South African forces under the command of Louis Botha, the Prime Minister, were to cause the Germans to surrender on the 9th of July, 1915. And this is quite often regarded as the first victory of the war. It was the first victory where whites were involved and was a huge propaganda coup for Britain, given that the Boers had been at war against Britain 15 years before. As the German Southwest Africa campaign, though, was coming to an end, the South Africans sought to find other avenues where its troops could serve. Discussions with London began. Kitchener wanted the mounted Boer forces for Europe. he somehow saw a role for mounted forces on the Western Front, not in the traditional sense, but in a revised format. To this extent, he had introduced training in the Indian cavalry units so that they could cope with carbines firing during the time that he was commander-in-chief in India. He did some innovative stuff there as well. At one point, even tried getting the Indian army to operate on snow skis. That wasn't very successful. Anyway, whatever he envisaged for the Western Front, though, in terms of mounted forces, does not seem to have survived, other than mentioned by MP Dr. Arthur Lee of a tirade by Kitchener about, and I quote, the preposterous waste of ammunition, and being aghast that the British Tommy could not be relied on to advance an attack with the bayonet unless the enemy has first been battered into a state of insensibility, close quote. Kitchener did not see the point in bombardments prior to attacks, regarding them as a waste of money and lives. His attempt, though, to get the Boers to Europe failed, although he did get South African infantry to Europe and approval for black labour, the South African Native Labour Corps. They arrived after he had died, though. These discussions were taking place at the time Kitchener's standing amongst the politicians and newspaper owners in London was waning. Before the final decision was made about the use of South African participation in the war, especially in East Africa, on the 3rd of November 1915, Prime Minister Asquith determined that Kitchener be sent to the Dardanelles to confirm in person the decision that a withdrawal from that theatre be effected. This would confirm the cabinet decision already made. Whilst he was away, Prime Minister Asquith took over as Secretary of State for War in order to put things on a better footing without the immediate supersession of Kay as War Minister, so he told Lloyd George. And it is through correspondence related to this that we get insight into Kitchener's view towards the war in Africa. During Kitchener's absence, it was finally agreed that South Africa would send a contingent to East Africa. Initially, this force was to be managed in the same way as Southwest Africa. However, due to internal political issues in the Union, the South African government decided it could not fund a force, and so the troops for East Africa, as well as those in Europe, were paid for by Britain, making them imperial service troops. The troops for East Africa tended to be those South Africans who wanted to protect the Union, but did not associate that closely with Britain, and they wouldn't go to Europe. Although a few senior officers had been pre-warned not to enlist for Europe, as a better opportunity would be forthcoming. That was according to Smuts. With a decision made to send the East African Expeditionary Force, it was agreed that General Horace Smith-Dorrien would command. He had been without a role since John French had fired him from the Second Army in spring 1915. Smith-Dorrien was felt to be the most suitable British officer to command a group of men who had effectively, as mentioned earlier, been at war against Britain 15 years before. He was acceptable to both sides. However, other options for the command had been Jan Smuts, South African Deputy Prime Minister, who felt that at the time he could not leave South Africa because of the political situation, and Winston Churchill. Kitchener returned to London and resumed his role as Secretary of State for War. On the 6th and 13th of December, Smith-Dorrien met with Kitchener, asking for an increased entertainment allowance because he had heard that entertaining in Nairobi was more expensive than doing so on the Western Front. He also requested equipment. Smith-Dorrien diarised that, quote, Kitchener is very cussed about my expedition because it was agreed by Asquith and Bonar-Law in his absence, and is quite impossible and throwing every difficulty in the way of my command in East Africa, close quote. As a result, on the 20th of December, Smith-Dorrien wrote tellingly to Asquith that, quote, Lord Kitchener's attitude is that you were the Secretary of State who decided on the campaign, that he does not approve of it and does not consider himself bound by the conditions under which I accepted the command, close quote. Kitchener had no idea what the government's intentions were regarding the theatre, but he would comply with Asquith's instructions. So why did Kitchener not approve of reigniting the African theatre? Quite simply, he did not see any point in fighting for something Britain had previously determined was not important. A decision had been made back in 1890 that Kilimanjaro, and in effect German East Africa, had no strategic importance for the British Empire, and that it could be given to Germany. This was in exchange for Heligoland. Kitchener had been party to this decision, having been a member of the 1885 Boundary Commission, representing the Foreign Office in Mombasa, where he engaged with the local Arabs in Arabic to the annoyance of the French and German delegates. Kitchener had also been the only soldier on the commission. Further, Kitchener then visited the territory in 1911 on his world tour, travelling overland around Lake Victoria, Nyanza, while he was looking for a farm to buy. This he did together with Humphrey Leggett, Arthur McMurdo, and Oswald Fitzgerald, who went down with him on the Hampshire, and they bought Songo Estates in Muhoroni on the Uganda Railway. Kitchener's plan was to spend the British winters in Africa and the summers in Broome in Kent, which he had bought the same year. The African purchase had been approved by his friend, the Governor of British East Africa, and railway expert Percy Gerard, who was soon to lose his post when it became known that he had awarded more land than he was allowed, and that some of it, like Kitchener's, had been in reserve territory. Kitchener never spent time on the farm, but was involved in its running. Days before he was due to go to Russia, he signed papers authorizing a limited company to manage the farm and raise finance. Leggett, who had been on Kitchener's staff in South Africa, was the man on the ground, managing the farm and keeping Kitchener updated. When I first discovered back in 2000 or so that Kitchener owned a farm in Kenya, my initial reaction was that he was reluctant to go to war in the theatre to protect his retirement investment. This was supported by the fact that the farm was just within raiding distance of the German border, and the reputation I had grown up with surrounding Kitchener. That is someone only out for himself. However, the discovery of the correspondence with Smith-Dorrien and the fact that Kitchener was out of the country at the time the decision was made to launch the campaign challenged this view. Other discoveries helped clarify matters. One of the conditions Kitchener placed on being appointed Secretary of State for War back in August 1914 was that he wanted to be present at the peace treaty discussions when they finally happened. His reason was to ensure that Germany retained its colonies, as this would ensure a longer lasting peace by maintaining a balance of power. I can't help but wonder what would have happened at Versailles if Kitchener had not died in June 1916. This apparent magnanimous approach to the vanquished was a consistent trait throughout Kitchener's time as a commanding officer. It is seen in his dealings with the dervishes, when he wrote to the Mahdi before the Battle of Omdurman, suggesting his surrender to protect the lives of women and innocents, given the imbalance of the forces. This was turned down with a resulting loss of over 10,000 lives. Again, in the 1899 to 1902 South Africa War, Kitchener had attempted in 1901 to negotiate peace with Louis Botha, as he foresaw unnecessary loss of life in prolonging the campaign. And then again in 1902, he was instrumental in negotiating with Botha and the other Boers to surrender unconditionally, as it would be likely that they would achieve their aim when there was a change in British government within a few years. That Kitchener had befriended the Boers, or at least gained their trust, was seen at the conclusion of the signing when some Boers refused to shake hands with Lord Milner, the governor. And it is also said that the Boers, Louis Botha, Jan Smuts, joined the First World War as eagerly or as willingly as they did because of what Kitchener had done during the Boer War negotiations. Kitchener had also tried to honour the Boers in his design of the memorial at Chatham, suggesting a frieze containing images of the 1881 Boer victory over the British. However, this was turned down by the military authorities, as they did not think the families of British soldiers would appreciate the sentiment of having the enemy praised or recognised. Finally, in India, at the end of his term there, Kitchener announced in one of his farewell speeches that he was grateful not to have fought a war in India, and probably was the first general not to have fought such a war. Instead, he saw the role of a general being to prepare for war in the fullest, and then to do everything in his power to prevent it happening. Kitchener's drive was long-term peace. Other evidence for this can be found in his management of Egypt as consul or agent, and other administrative roles he had. One of Kitchener's motives for not escalating the conflict in Africa was his concern about unnecessary loss of life. The closest he came to articulating this in regards to East Africa was refusing offensive action. There are numerous instances of his trying to save lives or preserve what he saw as the most expensive weapon in the army, manpower. For example, his cautious approach to weapons manufacture, where he insisted on the best quality being available. He had witnessed far too many men lost because of defective swords and guns. His insistence on solid training, even of the existing Territorial army, before deployment, and that the men serve under those who had trained them, was another. The Legion of Frontiersmen is probably the only unit not to have undergone set training before embarking for the front. For me, it is further evidence of Kitchener's reluctance to engage with non-Western Front theatres, although Alex Baum suggests it was because of the experience the force already had. The truth probably lies somewhere between, because although many of the recruits were new to the Legion of Frontiersmen, a number had previously served together and trained in the UK. They used to have operation military manoeuvres together. This perhaps is another area for further study. The Legion also had to pick up weapons along their journey, as there had not been enough to equip them before they embarked for East Africa. So Kitchener's decision or attitude to the war in Africa was that it should not happen. As a result, he did the bare minimum to balance local requests or concerns with what he felt were the priorities for winning the war. This meant his focus was on Europe, and the Western Front in particular. The consequence of this stance was that there was no one individual strong enough to take overall command and coordinate the African theatres. While West Africa resolved itself in the short term, and Egypt had a commander who reported into the War Office and was part of its plans, the lack of coordination had a major impact on the East Africa campaign, which was the longest running of the First World War, starting effectively on the 8th of August 1914 and ending on the 25th of November 1918. So far, we focused on British East Africa in the north of the theatre. However, there were actions happening on the southern German East Africa border with Nyasaland, Malawi, and northern Rhodesia, Zambia. The Germans raided into northern Rhodesia, or Zambia, as mentioned earlier, in late August 1914, causing the Belgians in Congo to come to Britain's assistance, much to the annoyance of the Colonial Office, who didn't want to have to rely or give land to another colonial power. Each territory in the south was under different command and military conditions. Nyasaland had a governor, while the Rhodesias were managed by administrators and the High Commissioner in South Africa, who was also the South African Governor-General. The Rhodesias were chartered company territory and not allowed to have a standing army, so were completely dependent on the British South African Police and Northern Rhodesian Police, as well as volunteers, including in Nyasaland, which was a protectorate. After the February 1915 uprising by John Chilembwe in Nyasaland, which took the Colonial Office, as well as the governor, completely by surprise, 200 South Africans were sent to support the forces there, with more arriving later. But it was only in late 1915 that any coordination was brought to bear in this theatre, with the appointment of General Edward Northey, who was recuperating after injuries sustained on the Western Front. Northey was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Nyasaland Northern Rhodesia Field Force in November 1915, a move which appears to have been initiated by High Commissioner Sidney Buxton. While there was, from early 1916, coordinated action in the south, there remained little coordination between the Northern Front, that is, the British East Africa-Kenya border, Lake Tanganyika, which Northey was to be responsible for, and which most people will know as the Mimi and Tutu boat expedition, and the south, where Northey was, until Jan Smuts, who had replaced Smith-Dorrien, and Northey decided to collaborate and share information. Both appointments, Smith-Dorrien and Northey, were authorized or approved by the War Office at about the same time. Yet, it does not appear that any consideration was made to link the two fronts. The only logical explanation seems to be that this was the time Wally Robertson was appointed CIGS in the move to undermine Kitchener's control at the War Office. Robertson approved Smith-Dorrien's battle plan for East Africa on Robertson's first day in the office, and I couldn't imagine hitting the ground running more. The division of responsibility between the Colonial Office and the War Office also played a part. Northey was a Colonial Office appointment, although nominated by the War Office, while Smith-Dorrien was a War Office appointee. Each force had its own payrolls and supply lines, little being coordinated except through the Admiralty, which played the linking role, trying to get everything where it needed to be in time. Another interesting aside, at least for me, is that according to A.C. Martin, historian of the Durban Light Infantry, the same broad approach was taken for the attack on Salaita Hill in February 1916, that is, using Smith-Dorrien's plan, as that by the South Africans at Okasongora or Kolkveld. It worked in Southwest Africa, but failed in East Africa, the terrain perhaps being a determining factor, although numerous military experts talk of the confidence of the South Africans in East Africa being a major factor. It will be interesting to see if David Katz has addressed this in his forthcoming book on Jan Smuts as a military commander during the First World War. The Battle of Salaita was commanded by Michael Tighe, with Smith-Dorrien's staff effectively managing the situation from South Africa, where command had been transferred to Jan Smuts on the 5th of February, it having been determined that Smith-Dorrien was too ill to proceed as Commander-in-Chief. Smuts officially took over command on the 12th of February, the day of the battle, and landed in East Africa on the 19th of February. There is no indication of how involved Kitchener was in any of these changes, but given Robertson's arrival on the scene and his approval of the plans, he was the likely person responsible for authorizing the change in personnel. It was effectively the arrival of the East African Expeditionary Force from February 1916, to be led by Smith-Dorrien and ultimately Smuts, that saw the introduction of a general staff and some sort of military order. That only really happened in 1917. It cannot be said, though, that Kitchener had any hand in this, as he had not approved the action, but rather simply the process and normal functioning of the British Army. The General Staff in East Africa, though, had a tough time in implementing order, as Smuts made personnel changes, introducing more South Africans to the staff, and also disregarded many of the accepted British procedures and routines. It wasn't his Boer way. It was also around this time that a War Office liaison with special responsibility for Africa was appointed to support the Colonial Office, which remained nominally in control of the theatre. It does not appear, though, that this liaison officer got involved in anything more than answering direct questions from the Colonial Office. And again, there's another study waiting to be undertaken. The big change in the East Africa theatre, other than that of Smuts' appointment and pushing the Germans back into their own territory and further south in 1916, happened after Kitchener's death. With the campaign in West Africa finally ending in Cameroon in February-March 1916, and the realization in East Africa that the terrain was not suited to white soldiers, they later worked out it wasn't suitable to most soldiers, irrespective of that background, it was decided to expand the East African force with men no longer required in West Africa, and also from the British West Indian Regiment, who could be spared. Further reinforcements had come from India after troops were released from Europe during 1915. There were complaints of some troublesome Indian troops being sent to East Africa to keep them out of India, but it does not appear that Kitchener had any say in this decision. Those decisions were made by the Indian government under Viceroy Lord Hardinge. Also, in 1916-17, moves were made to expand the King's African Rifles, which grew from 3 battalions to over 20 entering the field after a suitable period of training. And one battalion included German askari, who had then decided to fight for British rather than becoming carriers. Kitchener, no doubt, would have approved of this move. It had been part of his reason for sending his brother Henry to East Africa in early 1915. Kitchener had realized the value of local troops fighting in local conflicts. Early in his career, when appointed to Cyprus, and one of the reasons for his falling out with Lord Wolseley, and there were many reasons he fell out with Lord Wolseley, was his suggestion that local Cypriots be recruited to form an army. While this was rejected, he went on to show the value of using local troops in his training of the Egyptian and Sudanese armies, which were a mainstay of the attacks against the dervishes. Early indications suggest that Kitchener was behind the idea of using Black South Africans in an armed capacity in the 1899 to 1902 war, but more work needs to be done on this front as well, although we do know that armed Black South Africans did serve. It's who decided on that. Whether Kitchener's motives were for saving costs or whether for any other reason is uncertain, but it is clear that he would not have suggested such a move if he was not confident that they would succeed. He was not a man to embark on a venture unless the odds were strongly in his favor. It was also at the time the King's African Rifles were being expanded that a restructuring of forces on the Western Front occurred, which saw old South Africa hands returning to the theatre. In particular, that of Reginald Hoskins, referred to earlier, who had been Inspector General of the King's African Rifles, and who was to succeed Jan Smuts as Commander-in-Chief of the East Africa Forces in January 1917. Hoskins was only to serve for 3 months before Jaap van Deventer took over Smuts' works with Robertson back in London, playing a role there. And such was the feeling that many East African specialists speculate that the war in Africa would have progressed very differently had Hoskins been allowed to return to Africa from leave back in 1914, rather than be sent to the Western Front. And they are also strongly of the opinion that Hoskins should have stayed, rather than be removed after 3 months. That, as far as I can tell, was for political purposes in terms of the South African Union gaining credibility. During the last months of Smuts' command, there was a change in fighting approach from the more set battles to mobile warfare. Had Kitchener survived, I wonder what he would have made of the prolonged campaign, especially after Smuts declared that all that was required were mopping up operations. The war continued for another 2 years, and commanding officers Hoskins and Jaap van Deventer, who followed him, had to plead for additional equipment and men to be sent out. This was reminiscent of the situation Kitchener found himself in 1901, when Lord Roberts left South Africa, claiming effectively the same thing, leaving Kitchener to bring that war to an end. The result was that the war turned to guerrilla warfare, and Kitchener gained the reputation he did over concentration camps and farm burning. That Jan Smuts never saw a similarity between the campaign he waged against Kitchener in 1901-2 and that which he was waging against von Lettow-Vorbeck in 1916, I find absolutely fascinating. And it will be interesting again to see if David Katz has addressed this in his forthcoming book. I think it's due out now in May, June, and then in South Africa in August. This brings to the fore the issue of logistics, an aspect of the campaign which is calling out for someone experienced in military logistics to investigate. I've touched on the lack of coordination at senior level, but there was also the issue of continuity. Over the years of the campaign, the British Army in East Africa saw 12 different officers in command, in contrast to 1 on the German Army side. Of these, all but 4 were appointed under Kitchener's watch. Let's look at how much Kitchener was responsible for these changes. In the Northern Theatre of East Africa, Captain Lancelot Ward, being the most senior British officer in charge of the King's African Rifles on the outbreak of war, who happened to be in country, Kenya, became the first commander by default. By all accounts, he was en route to start his retirement when war broke out. From September, October, Generals James Stewart and A.E. Aitken of the Indian Army had command of Indian Expeditionary Force C and B respectively, for the protection of the British East Africa border and the invasion of German East Africa. The commands were split. Following the defeat at Tanga and at Longido, where Aitken and Stewart had misread their situations, General Wapshe was given command, and he stayed in post until his defeat at Jassen in roughly January 1915. Wapshe was informed by a telegram from Kitchener that you are entirely mistaken to suppose that offensive operations are necessary. Not long after, the War Office telegraphed, after careful consideration of the circumstances, it is considered that for the present you should adopt a definitely defensive attitude along the Anglo-German frontier from the lake to the sea, keeping your forces concentrated at suitable points to enable you to act as required. Secretary of State desires you to understand that with heavy calls all over the world, it is not practicable to meet requirements of East Africa at present, and that you must therefore bide your time. This was followed by the arrival of Henry Kitchener to advise on recruitment potential, the arrival of the squadron of Indian cavalry and some Baluchis, as well as authorization for the 25th Royal Fusiliers to be raised. When India was to send more troops to Mesopotamia, because of things heating up there, Kitchener sent Wapshe to the theatre instead of General Stewart, whom General Duff in India had requested. An unhappy Wapshe questioned his orders, writing to Kitchener, I hope that it is not because you disapprove of what I have done here that I am being transferred to the Persian Gulf. I feel great anxiety in the matter. To which Kitchener replied, your transfer to Mesopotamia was not due to any dissatisfaction on my part at what you have already done in East Africa, but as active operations of some magnitude are taking place near Basra, and TIE can carry on in East Africa, where operations must be restricted, I thought it better that you should be transferred to Mesopotamia. Despite Kitchener's reassurance, he obviously felt it was better to remove Wapshe from the theatre, given his constant attempts to find additional troops with which to tackle the Germans. Wapshe was duly followed by General Michael Tye, who continued through to February 1916, when Smith-Dorrien was expected to take over, soon being replaced by Jan Smuts. As mentioned earlier, it was the Cabinet and Wally Robertson involved in these appointments. In the south, prior to Edward Northey's arrival there in January 1916, General A.H.M. Edwards commanded the Rhodesian forces, and he's not to be confused with W.F.S. Edwards of the Uganda police, who accepted the German surrender in Abercorn Umbala in northern Rhodesia on the 25th of November 1918. Alongside A.H.M. Edwards, there was Captain C.W. Barton of 1 King's African Rifles in Nyasaland, who by default fell into the command post. Kitchener had no say in these appointments. Much has been written over the overstretched communication lines and the suffering of the porters and carriers, but little has been done, in my opinion, and I think numerous others as well, trying to research family accounts, etc., on the pioneers and engineers who were struggling to build bridges and roads. How best practice information was disseminated to the theatre, such as the Mills bomb, the Enfield rifle, given the reluctance to send equipment to East Africa, or Africa in general, and the Serbian barrel, amongst other things. Surgeon General Pike complained that improved ration quantities for Indian troops had not been communicated to East Africa, with dire consequences. Pike had been sent in late 1917 to investigate the medical situation in the theatre, as too many deaths and losses were being reported. The theatre ultimately saw 4 medical inquiries undertaken from 1917 as a result. Pike's report gives some indication of the complexity of logistics. 4 medical and 2 nursing forces were involved, as well as hospital ships and other support services. Each force was responsible for its corresponding military force, but also for what happened in its locality. Replicate and overlay the structure organogram for the medical services, with 1 for transport, lines of communication, engineers, labour, and other services such as prisoner of war camps, as well as the armed forces and the various responsible departments, and you'll have some idea of what all needed to be coordinated, with no central body to do so, as the War Office was doing for the Western Front. Orders in the general routine orders indicate how fluid the situation was on the ground. Van Deventer, soon after taking command, instructed that men who had changed units, including labour, without authorisation, be returned to their official unit, and later reminded officers of the need to inform base administrators of men or labour recruited on the spot. This was so that people could get paid accordingly. While there was a system for rotating men on the Western Front for leave, etc., there was no such luxury in East Africa, men serving for months on end without reprieve. Yet within days of someone being admitted to hospital, a replacement seems to be sent out. How was this managed when we hear of numerous men getting lost in the bush and maps being inaccurate? And communications, heliograph and telegraph, etc., not always working. To what extent was equipment, material, and provisions not getting through to the theatres because of the demands of other fronts, in particular the Western Front? This was certainly the issue behind the supply of boots in West Africa in 1914, and guns, cannons, and ammunition to South Africa at a similar time. Putting this talk together has reinforced for me again the incredible achievement of the forces on the ground in spite of the chaos and politicking amongst those managing the war when it comes to the war in Africa. Kitchener might not have articulated the issues and concerns raised here around logistics, etc., but no doubt his reluctance to embark on active campaigning in Africa during the war was consciously or otherwise influenced by his own experiences of conducting major campaigns on both extremes of the continent, one planned in detail over numerous years, the other more spur of the moment, and his first-hand knowledge of the East African terrain. No one person can be held responsible for how the war in Africa panned out, in the same way that no one man could have prevented what happened. But I hope that by taking a broad look at an individual, in this instance, Lord Kitchener, some new windows have been opened on the Great War in Africa, and particularly in East Africa, which by default seems to get most of the attention because of its longevity during the war. And I leave you with the thought, what if Kitchener had been able to hold his ground against the politicians and powermongers in late 1915 and managed to restrict Africa's further involvement in the war? Thank you.
Anne, thanks very much indeed. That was tremendous. Thoroughly enjoyed that. It was extremely thought-provoking. So, ladies and gentlemen, in the time-honoured manner, if we can just raise our hands as a silent round of applause to Anne for that presentation, and I can confirm that there's lots of hands going up as a silent round of applause. I know you can't hear it or you can't see the hands either. It's question and answer time, everybody. I was flabbergasted to hear that it was suggested that Churchill was going to be shipped out there. I mean, crying out loud.
He suggested himself.
All right, I was going to say, where did that one come from? Crikey! I mean, I know he got involved in a lot of things. But I had no idea that it was proposed for him to go out to Africa. But obviously that didn't get anywhere near, not remotely off the ground.
No, thankfully not. He did have people on the ground. He'd been involved in Freddie Guest, the MP being sent out to East Africa. And also the Admiralty had supplied various weapons and forces. So the Royal Naval Air Service and that was very operational in the theatre. So he knew what was going on, and obviously had other friends links with the theatre too. But he felt that that was something he could do.
Of course, yeah, naturally. He'd have sorted it out in a couple of weeks. Well, I mean, just following on then from my slightly sarcastic comments about Churchill there, which of the commanders-in-chief in Africa do you consider the most capable?
I think, well, it's between Hoskins and Van Deventer.
Okay.
Jan Smuts gets credit because he took the bull by the horn, so to speak, and moved the operations in. He was a political player more than a general.
Okay. Yeah.
And I think he achieved what he was asked to do, which was get the Germans out of British territory and start pushing them down, or getting rid of them. Hoskins was a man who knew the King's African Rifles very well. He'd served in Africa in the theatre from before the war, from about 1911. I think he'd been there, and he was busy trying to get the communication lines sorted out in the rainy season, and trying to fix all the mistakes, or the not mistakes, but the gaps that Smuts had left. Smuts just charged forward and believed that people could look after themselves in the field. Hoskins was very much, we've got to bring them in, we've got to have the supply lines with us. We've got to make sure that the roads and facilities are there for them. And he was really struggling with that. Van Deventer, for me, is a fascinating character, and I'm trying to get some more information put together on him, generally speaking. I think he did a lot of guiding of Jan Smuts as a commander, right from the Boer War days. They had a very good relationship in that way. And Van Deventer managed to get the general staff on board with him. Apparently he refused to speak English because he'd had a British bullet go through his throat during the Boer War and spoke with a rasp. So he would insist on translation with the general staff. But he adhered to British military procedures, which endeared him to the British military establishment. And he got the general staff to work with him. So a lot of the complaints about Smuts as a commander are from general staff type people who couldn't work with him. So it's a tough one as to who was the most effective.
Thanks. And Smith-Dorrien, I mean, obviously he's well regarded in Western Front terms, but and he never got a crack of it because of his illness. But would had he not become ill, do you think he'd have done well, or was it just outside his experience, and do you think he'd have just made a hash of it?
Well, my initial reaction, that was why I put in that bit about A.C. Martin, because although Smith-Dorrien had been able to reconcile with the Boers and after the Boer War, and was seen to be the British general who could work with both Boer and British at the same time, I thought him setting a battle plan in Europe without having seen the East African theatre is a step too far.
Yeah.
And also Robertson approving that on his first day in office hadn't had time to challenge anything.
That Robertson signing off so quickly just suggests that it was just trying to clear the decks and concentrate on.
Absolutely. And I think Robertson signed that off on the 20th of December, and Smith-Dorrien sailed on the 25th of December. And he fell ill en route, and it was felt sufficiently bad that he couldn't take command. What I find really interesting was that piece about the same battle plan used in Southwest Africa, which worked, because it was also South African forces who were fighting in both battles. And it was the South Africans' overconfidence or their attitude towards the German Askari that is put down as the reason for their failure. How did they manage if they were, they knew the German Askari from Southwest Africa. So I find that a really interesting anomaly or insight into battle plans, which is not my forte at all. So it needs a military expert to look at. I'm just looking at it from an external perspective of saying, here are two situations. You've got all these common denominators and these differences. How do they play out? And for that, I think I've got to rethink how well Smith-Dorrien would have made it in East Africa. So,
sure, it's very, very hypothetical, of course.
But I think he was very grateful not to have got the command afterwards. I mean, he didn't get another military command in the war. I think his next posting was as governor of Gibraltar or something.
Which isn't exactly pushing the envelope, is it?
No, but I think given how the East Africa campaign panned out, I think he must have been silently relieved.
Yeah,
he hadn't had to see it through.
Dodged a bullet, so to speak. Yeah. John has been waiting very patiently while we've been chatting there. John, hello. How are you? All right?
Yeah, thanks, David, and thanks for that, Anne. That was very good. The question, with all the chaos and the supply line issues, was there any sense of the rates of desertion? And I often wonder if there was any relationship between the Indian Army soldiers and the South Asian community that was already in West and South Africa.
Desertion doesn't seem to be a major factor on in the British Army forces, other than amongst the carriers. We come across that quite a bit. There is mention of men going AWOL, both KAR and white forces. Although there's more said about the German forces in terms of desertion. At one point, there's talk of, I think, about a third of the German Askari deserting, but we don't have those sorts of figures for the British forces. Whether it was just that commanders didn't want to really deal with it, I don't know. There is, with the carriers, it's either that people deserted or they fell ill along the way and didn't complete their journey. But there's not much said as to that. In terms of the Indian community already in Africa and Indians coming over, I've not picked up any link at all. In fact, very few Indians in East Africa actually serve. There is a volunteer unit in Mombasa, which forms right at the beginning of the war. But because of the jihad that the Ottoman Sultan had called, in terms of trying to get the Muslims to not support Britain, the colonial settlers felt that was a bit touch and go, having an armed Indian force, and so they have the Indian volunteers disbanded. South African Indians, they aren't prepared to serve in an armed capacity. They tend to follow in the Gandhi tradition of an ambulance corps, and so we have about 500 Indian stretcher bearers from South Africa serving East Africa. Their services offered anywhere where Indians are served, or Indians are serving. Smuts, I think, is hoping that they will then emigrate to the other places. But the War Office decides that East Africa is where they can go because they're going to serve with South Africans, which much to Smuts' disgust, I think. But there's no obvious link or mention of desertion on that front. A lot of men fall ill, which I suppose could be construed as a form of desertion, because you end up in hospital, etc. And a lot of men, and I'm thinking here particularly of the South African Labour Corps, the East African Native Labour Corps, who end up going back on SS Aragon to South Africa. About 130 of them died from just giving up. The doctors couldn't work out what was wrong with them. And they talk about men just having given up. So I would put that down to a desertion. It's not officially desertion, but it's a way of trying to get out of things, showing how bad it was. I don't know if that
anyway,
answers.
I want to thank you again, because I've heard about 3 or 4 presentations on the war in Africa, and you brought out a whole bunch of things that I hadn't heard before. So thank you.
Oh no, it's a pleasure. It's what I aim to do. There's so much to this campaign, or the African campaigns, I think that haven't even been touched on. So thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks for that. Anne, I'm just going to finish with one particular question, which might be a bit left field, and if it's not answerable, don't worry. But Kitchener's estate, Kitchener's farm in Kenya, wasn't it?
Yeah.
What happened to that after Kitchener's death? I guess it just got broken up.
It went to his brother. So there is actually a file about that thick at Kew, all dealing with the estate, and there's a legal issue because Kitchener left a large portion of his estate to Fitzgerald,
who went down on the ship.
Who went down with him.
Yeah.
And the legal case is proving, or the Attorney General is having to make a decision as to who died first, Kitchener or Fitzgerald.
As to who inherited. Yeah.
As to who inherited. And the decision is finally made that Fitzgerald preceded Kitchener, so that the line, the estate could stay in the Kitchener family line. So Henry Kitchener took over the farm. I think they did move premise. Some of the farm was sold and he bought other farmland, but he died in Kenya in 1937, aged 90, on the farm, and there's a file at Kew about that as well. And the family, as far as I know, left Kenya in the 1970s.
Right, and presumably just, I guess it's now still a farm, or possibly been split up amongst other owners. I think,
yeah, as far as I know, the farmland was sold. There was a photograph of the house, the Kitchener house, on an article, an online article a little while ago, and I was looking for it the other day for the presentation, but I see they've taken all the photographs off of that particular article for copyright reasons. So yeah, it's known that that was the Kitchener farm or Kitchener house.
Sure.
But yeah, it's still been there.
Okay. Anyway, look, it's now 9:20, so it's knocking on for the time that we normally finish. So on behalf of everybody who's been watching, Anne, thank you very much indeed for a very enlightening talk on a very I won't say unusual subject, but it's certainly not a subject that we tackle very often, and I'm glad that we have tackled it tonight and looked closely at this whole subject area. So on behalf of everybody who's watched, thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much for having me on my obscure niche topic.
Tremendous. Okay, and everybody who is not yet registered, please do register for next week's webinar. I know we're going to go fortnightly from now on in, but we are actually having a webinar on successive weeks because of various factors about the timing of this one, which is down to me, not Anne. So next week's webinar is on the 25th of April. And coincidentally or not, as the case may be, we're going to look at the Gallipoli landings, very appropriately enough. So if you've not yet registered, please do so. And Clive Harris will be coming back to talk to us about what happened at Gallipoli on the 25th of April 1915. And once again, thanks very much indeed. Everybody, thanks for watching and good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Mademoiselle.